Well, everyone, it's great to see you again. We've had a terrific conversation already with our guest today about education, so it promises to be a lively meeting today. I'm introducing Jane Lilley, who is the Education Officer for the River Dee Trust, and she's going to tell you about just what the work they do. I get the impression it's with schools and other community groups, and she's an ex-primary teacher, which focuses, I think, August very, very well indeed, Jane. So Jane, I'm going to leave it over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alan. Hello, everybody. I am so delighted to be here. This is a huge change from what I would normally do. Normally, I'm talking to lots of small children. So I can only apologize if I sort of revert to type and start talking about poo and bottoms, because that's the key with children and animals. So I want to talk to you about the River Dee Trust, which is the charity that I work for. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we do on the Dee. It's not something you hear about very often. Certainly before I started working for the Trust, I had never really heard of it. So just giving you a bit of an introduction to the river, what we do, and my job as Education Officer. I am completely open to questions at any time. Please feel free to pop your hand up and ask me a question. I can't promise I'll know the answer to it, but if I don't know the answer to it, I certainly know who to ask. So that's most of the battle, I think. I can always get back to you with any answers I can't find. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, which always makes me a little bit nervous. Hopefully you can see it. So this is just a photograph of the upper catchment of the Dee, a fair while away from where you guys are. I'm assuming that most of you are in Aberdeen. This is closer up to the source. The source of the Dee is up in the Breirich Plateau in the Cairngorms. It's the highest source of a mountain in what am I saying? It's the highest source of a river in the UK. Now, the River Dee Trust, which is the organisation that I work for, really has sort of two remits. The first thing that we do is science and research. So most of the people who work for the Trust spend their whole lives wearing waders, standing in the middle of a river, learning things about it. There's still loads of things that we don't know about the River Dee, and we do lots of sort of practical experiments to work out what is going on. I'll talk a bit more about the sort of practical science that we do in a second. The other thing that we do is education. Now, obviously, I'm biased, but I think that's way more important than any of the science. So what I do for a living is I talk to school groups. And you would be absolutely amazed how many children have never seen a live fish. So it's so important that we're getting out there and inspiring them about nature and their natural environment. Some of them don't have any idea that we have a river that runs through Aberdeen at all. So getting them involved and enthusing them about what is going on just outside their front door. I think rivers especially are they're quite tricky to engage with. The animals that live on rivers tend to be quite shy. They tend to do quite a lot of disappearing. Often children can name a duck as an animal that would live near a river, but not very much else. And that's just because most of it lives underwater. So the River Dee Trust tries to get in there. You know, I carry around buckets of beasties and invertebrates for them to look at and identify, just to help them to understand what there is underneath the water. So there are a couple of other things that we do. When it says improving access, that doesn't mean to people, that means to salmon. So that's building fish passes and fish ladders to try and get over some of the man-made obstacles that we put in their way. The other thing, the huge project that the River Dee Trust is doing at the moment is we're planting 1 million trees along the Dee. We've made it to 250,000 so far. I'll talk a wee bit more about why we're doing that, but it's a really exciting project and the kids absolutely love it, especially when you tell them that because we're planting most of them in the upper course, we have to use a helicopter to do it. So they get very excited about that idea. So I've got lots of beautiful pictures of the River Dee because I couldn't really not. It's such a gorgeous environment. I'm hoping that some of you might head out to the River Dee after this, now that we've finally arrived in flaming June after a really soggy, wet May. So I hope that lots of you will head outside. So the river is 88 miles long. It starts high up in the Cairngorms and it finishes down at Aberdeen Harbour. You can imagine, because it finishes at the harbour, there are some issues with that. There's a potential for noise and light pollution. So the River Dee Trust and the Dee Salmon Fishery Board, which is our sort of partner organisation, we work a lot with the Harbour Board to try and make sure that during key times for the wildlife of the river, that there isn't too much light going on at 3 o'clock in the morning, because that definitely confuses salmon. So we try to be sort of communicative and talk to other local organisations about how they can help the river as well. This is my favourite thing about the River Dee, is that we all drink it every day. So if you live in Aberdeen, every time you turn on the tap, you are turning on the River Dee. Every time you have a bath, you're having a bath in the River Dee. We rely on that clean water from the River Dee for life itself. Very few of the children that I work with have any idea that we get our water from the river. And when you say that when you flush the toilets, you're flushing away the River Dee, they all erupt into hilarious laughter. So we do get all of our water from the river. The River Dee has been important for thousands and thousands of years. Now, the picture that's up on your screen is of a 9,000-year-old piece of flint that was found by a group called Mesolithic Deeside. If any of you are particularly interested in this period of history, they're an amazing group. And every winter they go out, like in the photo, and they walk along ploughed fields collecting flints that were left there up to 12,000 years ago. This one was 9,000 years ago, and when it came out of the ground, it was so sharp that it could slice a piece of paper. It's totally amazing. The other amazing thing about this piece of flint is there isn't a source of flint anywhere near the Dee. The nearest source of flint is up in Bodham by Peterhead. So they had brought it all the way down to the Dee, and the reason they did that was Paleolithic, Neolithic and Mesolithic peoples were following the salmon migration. So once a year on the River Dee, there was this huge bonanza of food, and they followed it up. And obviously we are still catching salmon on the Dee to this day. I couldn't resist adding quite a few pictures of wildlife into this. I hope you don't mind. The thing that you need to know about me is that I am a primary school teacher by training, but I am a nature geek by passion. I absolutely love anything that is to do with animals. This lovely kingfisher, it was a photo taken on the Dee. What we say about animals like kingfishers is that if we've got healthy predators on the Dee, it's a sign of a healthy ecosystem. And although the Dee faces many challenges, we do have some absolutely amazing predators. And I think the kingfisher is probably the most spectacular. I've never managed to see one that was anything other than just a flash of blue whizzing past me. All these people who managed to capture these wonderful photographs of them sitting perched, I don't know how they manage that, because I only ever see them disappearing off into the distance. It's probably the galumphing of my footsteps, I should think. So the Dee is a special area of conservation. So that just means that it has these three key species: the Atlantic salmon, the freshwater pearl mussel, and the Eurasian otter. And because we have those species, these species in the river, we have a sort of special designation and protection for them that covers the whole river. Now, the first one is the Atlantic salmon. I'm hoping that most of us have heard of salmon. Some of us might eat them. If we do eat them, they are farmed rather than wild. So the River Dee has had a catch and release program. It was the first river in Scotland to stop the killing of salmon when they were caught. It's a really important part of our environmental protection, because salmon stocks have absolutely plummeted in the last 40 or 50 years. So we're working really hard to preserve those. Now, one of the things I often say is that the River Dee Trust is obsessed with salmon. We are absolutely obsessed with salmon. And the logic of that is that if the salmon population is healthy, everything else is healthy. So when we put things into place to protect salmon, we're not just protecting salmon, we protect everything else. So a healthy and diverse habitat is brilliant for salmon, but it's also brilliant for everything else. One of the things that most people don't realize about salmon on the River Dee is that they don't look like this big silver salmon at the very top for very long. So these adult salmon, they come back to the river where they were born to spawn. But for most of the time that the salmon is living on the River Dee, they are par. So they're these sort of, I think at the River Dee Trust, I'm supposed to call them golden, but I'm going to say that they're browny green. And they're beautiful little fish, but they are grumpy wee things. They're only about 4 or 5 inches long. They're quite small fish, and this is the sort of teenage phase of a salmon's life. And they will live as teenagers. I always, when I'm working with children, I get them to act out all the different stages of the salmon life cycle. And so for teenagers, they've got to cross their arms and frown. And that's because par are pretty grumpy. They're really territorial. They'll only live in parts of the river that have big stones because they don't want to see any other par. And if they do, they will fight with them. It's a bit like putting up a giant fence when you've fallen out with your neighbor. That's what they're like. And they will stay in the river for a couple of years at this stage in their life cycle. Once they reach maturity, they will then go through a process called smoltification, where they turn silver. They stop being unfriendly, difficult teenagers. They start hanging out in big groups, and they migrate down the river and out to sea. And this is just finished. They normally do it in April, is when they start heading out to sea. They go out to sea as little 6-inch long fish. And then while they're at sea, they are eating invertebrates and other small fish to get to be the salmon that we recognize as the big silver monsters that people hold up and take photographs of in their waders. So most of the work that we do at the River Dee Trust to protect salmon is not about protecting adult salmon. It's about protecting teenage salmon and making sure that they have the right temperatures and they have enough food in the river. Now, the freshwater pearl mussel, I don't know if any of you know anything about freshwater pearl mussels. They're not quite as glamorous as a salmon or an otter, but they are very, very rare, and we're really lucky to have them. They only live in clean rivers, which is one of the reasons why the population has declined. They are an endangered species, and Scotland has an internationally important population, and the Dee has a specifically good population of freshwater pearl mussels. Freshwater pearl mussels are mussels. I've got a shell on my desk so that you can see how big they are. I'm hoping you can all see my face, but the shell is about the size of my hand. They're big mussels. They're much bigger than the marine mussels that we eat. There are a few cool things about freshwater pearl mussels. The first cool thing is that when they reproduce, they have 1 million babies, which must be hard work. The other thing that they do is they're called ecosystem engineers. So because they're filter feeders, they feed by sucking water into their bodies. They actually clean the water on the way through. So each freshwater pearl mussel will clean about 50 liters of water every single day. They're totally amazing animals. They also have an awesome life cycle. And when I first learned about it, I thought, no, that can't be right. That's so improbable. The reason that they have 1 million young at once is because in order for the young to survive, there has to be either a salmon or a trout swimming past at exactly the right time. Because the salmon swim past, they breathe in the baby freshwater pearl mussels, which are microscopic. And those freshwater pearl mussels then go through their gills and stay lodged in their gills for about 9 months. So they do their early growth inside the gills of a salmon. And I just didn't believe that. I honestly thought that I'd made a terrible mistake when I read it. And the first time I said it out loud, I thought, no, that's ridiculous. But that is what they do. So that's another example of why helping the salmon helps other species. So the freshwater pearl mussel relies on salmon to survive. Now, freshwater pearl mussels are in decline, historically because of poaching. Obviously, every so often they contain a pearl. So historically, they have been at real risk of poaching. When I'm talking to children, I always say, bad guys come and steal them. And they get very outraged and start sort of these police forces in their classes where they'll patrol the river and phone me up if they think they've seen a pile of shells. So that's historically why there has been such a decline. Nowadays, their main problem is water quality. They can't survive if the water quality isn't good. So that's something that the River Dee Trust and the Dee Salmon Fishery Board work really hard to maintain. Now, the final one is my absolute favorite. So this is our third species that give us our special area of conservation status. So this is the Eurasian otter. I'm hoping that some of you have been able to see an otter at some point. Absolutely fabulous animals. When I talk to children about them, they're always completely amazed that they are predators because they think they're so cute. But then I'm sure they don't realize that their domestic cat is a predator, too. But they're always a bit upset when I tell them that they rip the heads off salmon and tear their guts out and all of that sort of thing. So this is the Eurasian otter. We have these on the river. Their population has grown recently. So we're feeling really excited about that. My favorite fact about the Eurasian otter is that their poo smells nice. So if you ever want to go out walking along the Dee and you find some otter spraint, otters are territorial, so they tend to put spraint all around the area where they live so that otters know that they're there. And otter spraint smells a bit like jasmine. It's a really pleasant smell. And obviously I'm a nature nerd, so whenever I see any otter poo, the first thing I do is go up and smell it, because what else are you going to do when you're out and about? So I've popped an osprey in here. This isn't one of our species that gives us a special area of conservation, but we do have them on the Dee. If you want to go and see an osprey locally, the best place that I know, the place where you'll have the most chance of seeing one, is at Reservoirs Trout Fishery just outside Banchory. They have got an osprey nest, and there are ospreys nesting right this very minute. So if you want to go and have a look, you can certainly go there. Mike, who owns it, is absolutely charming. I'm sure he would let you go out with a pair of binoculars and have a wee look at the osprey doing its thing. So ospreys are migratory animals. They spend most of their life, they spend our winters in various African countries, and then they return to Scotland to breed. There are actually more golden eagles in Scotland than there are ospreys. We don't often think about how rare they are. They are rare, and there are several pairs around Aberdeenshire, so we're really lucky. So now now that I've done isn't the River Dee amazing, I'm going to talk to you about some of the challenges that the River Dee faces. There are lots, and we're at sort of a pivotal time for the river, and we need to do lots of work. So the first challenge is the declining salmon population. So up here, we've got a graph of salmon catches from the 1950s until 2020. As you can see, it's not pretty. Fishing on the Dee is hugely important. It makes around about £15 million for the local area every year. And people come from all over the world to fish on the Dee. It's one of the big 3 salmon rivers in Scotland. But we have seen catastrophic decline in our salmon population. And that decline in salmon population goes across to everything else. So we have got major decline. Now, this graph is slightly misleading. So in the yellow, it separates out spring salmon, which is something that the Dee was particularly famous for. Salmon starting their migration up the river early in the year. It looks like we're now catching more salmon in June to September than we are in February to May, which is true. That's mostly down to the fact that anglers have changed their practice. So as the spring salmon catch fell, people stopped booking to come in spring because nobody wants to stand in a river for a week and not catch anything. So they now tend to come later in the year. We've extended the season as well so they can do that. So October is on the new parts of the graph. But it's really a species under threat. We think, or actually we know, there was some great work done by Marine Scotland on the Esk, which is obviously very near to the Dee. And in the 1970s, around about 40% of salmon that were hatched in the river were returning to the river they were born in to spawn. That figure is now 4%. So there has been a catastrophic decline. And we think that these are factors that are happening at sea, things like climate change, the seas warming, lack of invertebrates for them to feed on, that it's having a huge effect on the salmon that come back to the Dee, which is why we are so obsessed with salmon, which is why we treat our par, our teenage salmon, like royal babies, making sure that they are as happy as possible, because we know that the stronger they are leaving the river, the more likely they are to come back into the river. Another threat that the river faces are invasive species. I'm sure if any of you walk along the river, you will have seen certainly some of these plants. We've got giant hogweed, Himalayan balsam, Japanese knotweed. Another one that we have quite a lot of on the Dee is American skunk cabbage, which you can't miss because it's bright yellow. And if you go close to it, it doesn't smell great. So that's how you know it's a skunk cabbage. The one at the bottom is an American mink. Now, the American mink is the sort of baddie of the River Dee. The River Dee Trust and the Dee Salmon Fishery Board do lots of work with volunteers to try and trap American mink because they do such damage to the ecosystem. They are just indiscriminate predators. The thing that in this photo, the mink has a salmon par in its mouth, but actually their favorite thing to eat is a water vole. And water voles are pretty much the cutest animal that's ever existed. They look a little bit like a giant hamster. And they live up on the Dee, but unfortunately, the American mink think they're absolutely delicious. So they have, mink first arrived in the UK in the 1920s. We had our first wild populations down in Devon. I think they were recorded in the 60s and 70s. Since then, they have completely decimated the water vole population of the UK. So a lot of work has been done to try and control the number of mink, to try and restore that population of water voles. And it does seem like we're making some headway, which is quite exciting, because often controlling invasive species can be quite a thankless task. If you've been down the river and you've seen the amount of Himalayan balsam or the amount of Japanese knotweed that's out there, it's a bit like painting the fourth rail bridge. It just never finishes. You've dealt with one part and they spring up somewhere else. It's also worth noting, Himalayan balsam is my favorite invasive. Not that I'm allowed to have a favorite, don't tell anybody I said that. Just because it's so pretty. They're beautiful pink flowers. They do really cool things, like they reproduce ballistically. So their seed heads explode to spread their seed, which is cool, but unfortunately that means their seed can travel 7 meters and they take over an entire riverbank. The reason we have Himalayan balsam is because Victorian people, or I was about to say Victorian ladies, but that sounds terribly sexist. Victorian people absolutely love them. And they used to wander through forests spreading seed absolutely everywhere because they're so beautiful and they get along so well in the UK climate. And now we are overrun with the stuff. So that's something that the River Dee Trust does an awful lot of, is controlling invasive species. We also deal with water quality. So in the same way as I was saying earlier that we would liaise with the Harbour Board to deal with sound and light pollution, we also liaise with farmers to talk about pollution from their fields ending up in rivers. So that runoff is true for pesticides, it's true for fertilizer. What the children like most is that it's true for cow poo as well. So we also often spend quite a lot of our time talking to farmers about how to protect the river from chemicals and effluent from their cattle. It's quite an easy thing to do. It's not like farmers aren't nature lovers. There's no real fight about it. It's more about making people aware that there is a problem and asking them to fix it, and they do. In this picture, we've got a farmer in the middle, and then we've got Flora and Steph, who are riparian habitat experts. So they deal with the habitat on the banks of the river. They work for the Dee Salmon Fishery Board, which is the sister to the River Dee Trust. So yeah, what do we do? What do we do to deal with some of the dangers that the Dee is facing? The pictures that you've got up on your screen at the moment are pictures of electrofishing. Now, this is really about the science. So the first thing we do is science, and we gather data about what is going on in the river. Electrofishing, if any of you don't know, involves using a piece of equipment that looks a bit like a metal detector. And what it does is it emits an electrical current, and it briefly stuns fish in the river. We then catch them, and we measure them, and we weigh them to try and get a picture of what the populations of fish are like in different parts of the river. Now, I'm not allowed to go electrofishing. I'm allowed to go, but I'm only allowed to hold the bucket. I'm not allowed to actually actively take part, but I wanted to go on record that I am an excellent bucket holder, and I take it very, very seriously. I love going out electrofishing because it means that you get to see the fish that you would never normally see. So I've held smolt and I've held par in my hands, and it's a bit like sort of finding a jewel buried in the ground, because it's just not something you would ever see. So as well as doing electrofishing, we also take temperature data and that sort of thing to just try and get a better picture of what's going on the river. And the Scottish Government has recently standardized how we do this. So every river in Scotland is electrofishing, is recording temperature data, all in exactly the same way. And the hope is that you will end up with a really complete picture of where the problem areas are and what needs to be done to deal with them. The other thing we do, which is my personal favorite, is we run a smolt tracking project. Now, the smolt are the young salmon that are traveling down the river to go out to sea. The picture on the right-hand side is called a rotary screw trap. And we place these in the river, and the smolt tend to travel at night. So we catch the smolt, and then in the morning we turn up and we weigh them and measure them and count them. But we also perform surgery on the smolt. What we do is we cut a small hole in their bellies and we insert a tracking device and then close it up again. And that allows us to have data about where these smolt are going. How many of them are being predated by goosanders or dolphins or otters or mink, and we get to follow them. So the picture on the right-hand side is the data we got. I think this is 2018. This is the smolt tracking data from that year. And each line is a smolt. The reason that it stops in a semicircle is because that's as far as we can follow them. We have to put tracking receivers at different parts down the river, in the harbour, and then out to sea so that we can track exactly where they're going. I think it's really cool that you can do that. I went out and I helped them to do that this year. And it was just completely amazing to watch it happen. When they do the surgery on the fish, they anaesthetize them first, obviously, and then they put them back in a bucket and they give them about 20 minutes to sort of regain consciousness. And then they have to be released with friends. They can't go out into the world on their own. So you have to catch some extra ones, and then you pop them all in the river and they have a few hours to acclimatize, and then you let them go and they all go off together. It's really cool. So that's smolt tracking. That's another thing that we do. The next step, having done the sort of science and gathered the data, the next step is then intervening based on that data. There's very little point in just collecting the information and doing nothing about it. So I've got two pictures for you here. The first picture, which is two trees lying in the middle of the river, those trees didn't get there by accident. We put trees in the river. We call them large woody structures, but really that's code for a tree. We take wind-fallen trees from in the catchment, and on giant diggers, we drive them to the River Dee, and then we bury them into the river. The reason that we do that is if we have done electrofishing in a particular area and we found that there wasn't much in the way of biodiversity, there weren't very many species found in that area, it's normally because the habitat is too poor to support enough life. When you put a wind-fallen tree into the river, it creates a diverse habitat. the water changes direction, it moves silt, and you end up with some parts where it's quite standing or it's quite still water. You'll end up with fast water going around the sides, and it changes the substrate of the river as well. So that's why we do it. And it's just to try and enrich the river and to make it as varied as possible, because obviously different animals like different things. So variety is the key. The other picture, which is a slightly less exciting picture, this is Edwin, who works for the River Dee Trust. And in his hand, he's holding a big bunch of deer legs. So we get these from the estates in the catchment area of the River Dee. And we're doing a big experiment at the moment of trying to add more nutrients into the river. And what we do is we take maybe 10 deer legs and we stake them into the bottom of the river. And then we'll measure beforehand how many invertebrates and how much invertebrate life we found. And then we will place the deer legs in and then see if that has had a positive effect on how many invertebrates we found in the river. Because obviously those invertebrates are the foundation of the food chain. They're the things that are feeding all the other animals in the river. And it's important to make sure that there are enough of them. It's not very glamorous, but the early results suggest that it has been really successful. So we may well keep doing that for years to come. The other thing that we do, our huge project, is tree planting. So the reason that we tree plant actually goes back to the previous slide. It's about getting these large woody structures into the river. So we plant trees along the sides of the river. The river would once have had trees all around. That's not the case anymore. In the sort of Victorian and Edwardian eras, we cut down an awful lot of trees to help with sporting interests. So a lot of the side of the River Dee has been deforested over the last, and actually it's unfair of me to blame the Victorians and the Edwardians, but let's say over the last few thousand years, we've lost almost all the trees that live in the upper catchment. So not only do those trees eventually fall into the river and help to create a diverse habitat, they also drop their leaves. Those leaves then go on to add nutrition to the river. So hopefully we won't have to keep doing the deer leg work for too long, because eventually it will be decaying leaves that will be providing that nutrition. The other thing that trees provide is shade. Shade is hugely important in the upper catchment. As the temperatures are getting higher, it's getting less and less possible for salmon to live in the upper catchment. So salmon have specific sort of lines in the sand about temperature. At around about 24-degree water temperature, they stop eating. And at around about 28, they die completely. So a couple of years ago, we recorded water temperatures up in Braemar of 27.2 degrees. So we're getting perilously close to the point where salmon won't be able to live on the upper catchment. So by planting trees, we're hoping to provide the dappled shade that those animals need just to bring the temperature down a little bit so that we can provide a habitat for those animals. We control invasive species. We work with CC, the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative. We work with them spraying. Also, we do something called balsam bashing, which is a bit more romantic than spraying. With Himalayan balsam, you break it rather than spray it. Obviously, spraying chemicals or poisons near a river is a really skilled job. The last thing that we would ever want is to put some hideous poison on some Japanese knotweed and for it to suddenly pour with rain and all of that poison would end up in the river. So it's quite a sort of nuanced thing to do. We haven't done any spraying recently because of all the rain. So we will be starting up again. And the reason that we take what are quite drastic measures in spraying is because those invasive plants can do so much damage because they affect the ability of all other plants to live on the river. So they inhibit the growth of trees. They also don't provide an appropriate food source for our native animals. They outcompete our native plants, and then that causes a problem in the food chain for the other animals that live on the river. And then education, that's my bit. This is my specialist subject. So this is what I do. I spend every day out at schools. Things have been a bit odd since COVID started. I actually started my job in lockdown. So I have never worked in the office. I still get phone calls from people at the office who I've never met before. It's all a bit odd. And obviously it had a big effect on schools. Schools were closed for a lot of it. So I was here at home making resources and worksheets for teachers to use as part of their homeschooling. Thankfully, we're now back in schools. It's all a bit different. I'm not able to take children out onto the river because they can't get the staff and parents aren't allowed to help. So I bring the river to schools. I arrive with buckets full of dragonfly larvae and water boatmen, and sometimes really cool things like diving beetle larvae, which look exactly like you would imagine an alien to look. And the kids get to be scientists for the afternoon. So they spend time identifying them. We learn about the habitats that they like to live in. And we use that as a way of teaching about ecosystems and the food chain. Because without all of these little tiny things, we couldn't have otters and kingfishers and all of the other things that we have. We also do activities where they're building rivers out of natural materials. That's when I spend a lot of time saying, stop throwing stones. And they're running around the playground trying to collect enough things to make the source and meanders and banks. And it's great fun, and it's been such a pleasure. As Alan said to begin with, I used to be a primary school teacher. So I gave it up to sort of come and live the dream and spend my whole life talking about wildlife and nature, and it has been an absolute dream. So that's another, sorry, that's my work phone. That's another huge part of what we do at the River Dee Trust. And to my mind, although I would obviously say that, it's really, really important that we get the next generation engaged and involved in what's going on in their local area. I think that the thing that I always say to them is the reason that I'm here talking to you is that you're going to live for longer than I am. And I really want you to be looking after the River Dee for the rest of your life. So hopefully a few of them have taken that on board and will be vociferously protecting the River Dee forever and ever and ever. And if that's the case, then I can go to sleep happy. So that's education. This picture was actually taken in the little bothy down at Riverside Drive. If you've ever been walking down there, there's a fishing bothy that's always fascinated me, but this is what it looks like inside. It's got lots of photos on the walls and things. So what can you do to help if you want to help? Not that you have to. So this is another photo of the upper course. As you can see, not very much tree life going on up there. So there are 3 things that members of the public can do to help. You can volunteer with the River Dee Trust. We do tree planting expeditions and things like that. Actually, the photo up here is a volunteer monitoring a mink raft. So mink rafts go into the river. We put them into the river. They look like a little wooden tunnel. And at the bottom of them, they've got a clay pad. So we put them in for a few weeks to begin with, and volunteers will go and check. And they're checking because mink are really curious. And basically, if the mink see a new wooden tunnel, they'll go and have a wee look, and they'll step over the clay pad, and then we know that there's a mink in the area. And then the next time we put a trap in it so that we can capture the mink. That's what a mink raft is. That's something that you could do to help. The other thing that you can do is donate to us. We run lots of different donation packages through our Just Giving page. You can buy a stand of trees and give it to somebody as a friend, and we will go out and plant a stand of trees for you on the River Dee. You can leave gifts in your will. Yes, so donation is one way of doing it. And the other thing that you can do is email your MP. So we're trying to get lots of people to email their local MPs about the way taxation works with planting trees. So at the moment, we don't get any grants for planting the trees that we plant up on the Dee. Whereas if we were to plant a stand of spruce or larch, we would be able to. So there's a big discrepancy about how the law in Scotland works around planting trees and planting native trees. So all the species that we plant are native species, and the Scottish government don't help us to do that. And we would really like them to help us, because the way we see it is that it's a matter of life and death. And we've got to get going on this soon. So our plan is to plant our 1 million trees within the next 15 years. And hopefully we will make it there, but I suspect that we will need the Scottish government's help to do that. So that's it. That's really all I had to say to you today. Thank you all so much. I hope that you go out to the river, especially on a day like today, and just enjoy it, walk along it, talk about it, fish in it, just have a great time. If anybody's got any questions that they would like to ask me, they absolutely can. Again, I can't promise you I'll know the answer, but I will do my very, very best.
Everyone, if you have a question, by all means, put your hand up and we'll get round to you. Can I start with one just from what you just, oh, sorry, you, and then you go.
I was intrigued about the bit about the temperatures and the planting the trees and whatever. What, I mean, knowing what's happened to the coral reefs and whatever, what would be the time factor? Would there be a situation that if the temperature of the river did start to creep up, that the salmon would adapt? Or is there no chance that they would adapt and they would just end up being wiped out?
I think, I don't know a concrete answer to that, but I think the temperature is rising so quickly that right, I can't see that they would be able to adapt in that sort of time. I mean, they will adapt in that they would simply stop living.
Going up there, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. But a physiological adaptation, no, I think it's just too fast.
Okay.
I'm thinking, Gina, about the last thing you said about the Scottish government refusing to fund your tree planting. Is that just a lack of cash?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that I think it's more that tree planting policy hasn't really caught up with the ecological science. So there are tree planting schemes that exist, but they don't focus on planting native trees in places that are in crisis. So it's about realigning priorities, I think.
Yeah, it simply appeared to me that you're doing the right thing by planting native species, increasing biodiversity and attracting the appropriate sort of animals to the area.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it seems like we're of course doing completely the right thing, and you know, obviously we should be the ones, but then I suppose all charities think that they're the ones who should be getting support. But we are, from an ecological perspective, we certainly are doing the right thing. The species that we're planting, we plant alder, we plant aspen, we plant willow. These are all trees that bring a huge number of insects into an area. I think a willow can support something like 260 different types of insect.
Yes, Anne, on you go.
Having been a primary teacher as well myself, and I'm really delighted that you're doing so much work with children. Do you do it with secondary age children as well?
I have done, yes. Well, actually, it's been slightly limited with secondary school children in the last year. I've only been doing it for a year, but that's a COVID thing rather than a lack of willingness. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is getting children with additional support needs out on the river, because I think that it offers them a chance to develop their resilience, to explore something that they're good at, and to find out about practical jobs that they might want to do. And I have worked with several of the Prince's Trust Achieve groups who focus on sort of non-traditional subjects. So yes, I have worked with secondary school students, but I'm really excited to work with more. But it has been a bit tricky with the old COVID, because teenagers have a different, they have different social distancing requirements and things like that. So it's more practical.
When COVID has gone or whatever, or we can move more normally, are there plans for a series of activities that children can get involved in, even if their school hasn't had the good fortune of being linked to you? Are they going to do plan activities, tree planting or something that in general children can be invited to come along and get involved? Because that's the way I think to really get a permanent love and caring of the Dee, is to get really involved, isn't it?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think I hadn't actually thought about it from that perspective, in that maybe appealing to sort of individuals rather than a school might be the way forward. We had planned on doing sort of family days where, you know, the whole family came out and planted trees. COVID ruined that. So I think we'll probably move back in that direction. But, you know, just getting, you know, giving families a space where they can come out and they can get involved would be amazing.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yes, on you go, Pat.
I've no I've no plans to go foraging, but who owns the mussels with potential pearls in them, and how are they protected?
Oh gosh, that's a brilliant question. Please don't go foraging for them. That would be the I don't know the answer to who would own them specifically, because obviously the River Dee has owners all the way up. So I would imagine that the person who owned the river, the section of the river, owned the mussels in it, but they are highly protected. So it's completely, actually, for example, I showed you my shell. It's actually against the law to pick up a shell on the side of the Dee and take it home. That's the sort of level of protection they're at. It's also illegal to even take a photograph of a freshwater pearl mussel without a license. And so they are very, very highly protected, and the wildlife crime unit would be on you like a shot. I found out that you weren't allowed to collect these. I didn't collect this one, just to put that out there. I had just started working for the River Dee Trust, and I found a freshwater pearl mussel shell, and I was so delighted. So I popped it in my pocket and I drove back to the office, and my boss, the river director, is called Lorraine Hawkins, Dr. Hawkins. And I got it out and I went, look what I found, look what I found. And I was just fizzing with joy, and I had to go and put it back. So I had to sort of shamefacedly get back in my car and go and walk up the river and put it back again.
Thank you.
On you go, Bob.
Yeah, you'd mentioned the runoff from fields as one potential danger for the river. But I mean, given that the Dee is very much in agricultural land, there's not much industry there. Are there other problems of pollution?
Well, yes, there are other problems of pollution, specifically when we have things like flooding events. Then you end up with human effluent being the issue that happens in the river. I think SEPA, which would be the organisation that deals with pollution, comes out to the Dee fairly often. It's normally just mistakes, you know, building work that's happening on the side, and they hadn't really taken into account the river. When it comes to the agricultural land along the Dee, you're absolutely right. The middle course is almost entirely agriculture. And it's sort of a testament to those farmers that we have managed to get such a healthy river. So farmers are they put in sort of boundary margins between their fields, so that there's a little bit of space for the to sort of stop things ending up in the river, and fences and things like that. But there certainly are other pollution events, but they tend to be more one-off pollution events rather than a continuing problem of things that are going into the river.
Okay, thank you.
Oh yes, on you go, Joan. Joan, yes.
You talked, Jane, about the fact that all the water we use is from the Dee. Now, I assume that is collected in the reservoirs. How many reservoirs are there on the length of the Dee?
Now, Joan, I am miffed that you've asked me that question, because I do not know the answer.
Right. But I mean, we probably all know the ones that are very local to us. I can think of two very near where we are in the sort of Mannifield area.
Well, you're doing better than me, because I can only think of one. I can only think of Inchgar as one that's near Aberdeen.
yes, and there's one, I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of between Craigton Road and a bit lower down. I don't know how big it is. Anyway, I just wondered if there are these reservoirs sort of periodically all the way up.
Well, I would answer it if I could, Joan, but I
Okay.
can't. I'm going to say yes, but that's a guess. I'm sorry, I can't answer that question, but I can absolutely promise you I will be doing my homework tonight. So the next time I get asked it, I know the answer.
Thinking of the population and the amount of water that we all use, often wasting quite a lot. It's a huge pressure on the river, isn't it?
Yes, and I think I was talking to our director, Dr. Hawkins, quite recently, and she's doing some work into water use and how it affects the river at the moment. Because as a general rule, it's not a problem. We're in Scotland, it rains all the time, but there are certain pinch points in the year, and I would imagine we'll probably be coming up to one quite soon, given how warm it's being, where some parts of the river the water level gets too low to support the life that we would like to be in there. So it's a sort of delicate balancing act between providing for the needs of the people of Aberdeen, but also providing for the needs of, you know, the natural environment around us. As with everything, I suppose, we're always in a balance, aren't we?
Thank you.
I think that's about all the questions. That was great. I think actually Joan was referring to the Area Hall Reservoir.
Yes.
Description. That's the one that it's covered over, so it's not actually seen, as you know, from the thing. You're right, there's quite a few of them between here and Cults that you can see mounds going over them there.
I didn't even know there was a reservoir at Area Hall, so that's quite, I've learned something new today, thank you.
Actually, there's one in our back garden. They're good neighbours of ours. Oh, is it back to Joan?
I have one other thought that keeps on coming into my mind. I am not someone who fishes, and the whole idea of the sort of commercial side of fishing worries me. And I wonder how you feel, Jane, about all these kind of wealthy people who come along and get their license to fish for salmon in the Dee. I just, I don't know. I think back to Schubert's song, The Trout, where he watches someone trying to catch a fish and he's hoping against hope that they don't manage to catch one. And he based the whole song on that, you know. And I just feel for the fish. How do we know that hooks getting stuck inside their mouths don't actually distress them? And should we really be doing this?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And it's something that my personal opinion, I feel like I have to say that loud and clear, has changed a lot since I came to the Trust. So I used to be fairly anti the whole idea because I don't think it's terribly nice to put a hook in an animal's face. But it's thanks to those people fishing that the biologists at the River Dee Trust have a job. So it's fishing that finances all of the improvements that happen on the River Dee. Mm. And I think from a personal perspective, it would be great if there were another way to do it, but I feel unbelievably grateful for all the people who come up to the Dee to do it, because that sort of the practical science work is not cheap. And I feel really grateful that it's the Dee Salmon Fishery Board that tends to finance the biology work that goes on in the River Dee. And at the moment, I just don't see another way of doing that. And especially at such a critical time when we have to gather this data, we have to know what's going on so that we can try and fix the problems. I just don't know of another way of doing it. So I feel very grateful every time I see a man in waders. Sorry, that was, again, not always a man.
Thank you. Thank you.
Actually, I should say, if any of you want to take up fishing, the River Dee Trust and the Dee Salmon Fishery Board do sort of taster courses so that you can learn how to fly fish. If you want to have a look on our website and you fancy a bit of fly fishing, please feel free to give it a go.
Jane, I think that's all the questions. And well, first of all, everybody, thank you very much for your attendance today and your questions, as always. And Jane, thanks to you. If I were a classroom teacher, I would certainly be contacting you very quickly to do a project on the River Dee. A, it's local. B, it's vital for everybody, including wildlife and ourselves. And what a fantastic holistic project our teacher could put together based on one visit from you.
Well, that's the hope, Alan. I also talk an awful lot about poo and bottoms. So there is that, you know, there's the fun angle as well. So I want to say a huge thank you to everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening so attentively. I'm not used to people listening so well because I'm used to children. So I'm used to sort of people flailing their arms and disappearing. So it's been a real privilege for me. Thank you all so much. And if you want any more information, please find us on our website. Yeah, please get in touch.
Great, Jane. Thank you again.
I'll say goodbye.
Great.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Before you all go as a group, I'll see you again in 2 weeks' time. That's Tuesday, the 15th of June. And we're joined by, it's a person from another trust, the Sandpiper Trust. It's Lorna Duff who manages it. And they raise money for equipment and training for medical responders to any emergency. So it sounds really, again, a fascinating thing. They've got over 200 volunteers whom they train, doctors, nurses, paramedics, to respond very quickly to a medical emergency. So again, should be another fascinating talk. With that, I'll see you again in 2 weeks.